The peace of a century-old farm is shaken when a new caregiver wins the affection of the widower's three daughters. But as their bond flourishes, a deceptive presence begins to undermine the harmony with cruel traps. When a health crisis puts one of the girls' lives at risk, doubt and fear fill the house. What no one expected was that the truth had been silently recorded, ready to turn everything upside down. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's begin. The morning sun cast a golden glow across the sprawling ranch that stretched as far as the eye could see. But inside the grand main house that crowned the property, the air felt heavy with memories that refused to fade. James Porter, a millionaire rancher whose life had been built on hard work and determination, carried not only the weight of his success, but also the burden of a grief that wouldn't heal. His wife had passed away a few years ago, leaving behind 3 5-year-old triplets, girls who were bright and curious, but each dealing with their mother's absence in different ways. Since then, James had tried his best to keep his daughters supported and loved, but the responsibility of managing thousands of acres, dozens of employees, livestock, and business operations constantly drained his energy. The triplets were his greatest treasure, but also his deepest worry. Emma had developed nighttime anxiety attacks, waking up screaming from nightmares she couldn't explain. Grace was extremely quiet, communicating mostly through drawings she made with colored pencils, her little hands creating worlds where words failed her. Lily, though more talkative than her sisters, had developed an intense fear of being away from her father, clinging to his leg whenever he prepared to leave the house. Despite their individual struggles, the 3 girls were united in a touching way, sleeping curled up together, walking hand in hand around the property, and captivating everyone on the ranch with their sweetness. James's fiancée, however, saw no charm in them whatsoever. Victoria Ashford was a woman accustomed to sophisticated city life, someone with social ambitions and a taste for the spotlight. She viewed the triplets as obstacles to her rise within the family structure. She concealed her true character behind expensive perfume and rehearsed smiles, but anyone who spent enough time around her noticed that her eyes never truly warmed. Her plan was simple yet calculated: gradually reduce the girls' presence in their father's life, distance anyone who created bonds with them, and slowly assume complete control of the main house and everything it represented. It was into this scenario that a simple worker arrived at the ranch, having traveled from another town after responding to a job posting. Sarah Mitchell carried few belongings, just a worn duffel bag containing some clothes, an old journal, a photograph of her mother, and a quiet faith that had sustained her through a significant loss. In her life, a delicate memory she avoided discussing with others. She needed to work to help support her sick sister back home, and saw this ranch as an opportunity for a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life far from the pain she'd left behind. As she crossed through the main gate, she was greeted by Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, an elderly woman with a gentle manner of speaking who was respected by everyone on the property. Mrs. Henderson informed her that Mr. Porter was a good man, the triplets were sweet children, but the house had lived under a shadow since the former Mrs. Porter's passing. The new employee listened quietly and promised to do her very best. On her first day, while climbing the stairs to clean the upstairs hallway, Sarah heard muffled giggles and tiny footsteps. It was Emma trying to carry a basket of toys that was bigger than she was. Sarah offered to help. The little girl looked up with distrustful eyes at first, but seconds later broke into a shy smile, the kind that illuminates the soul of anyone who witnesses it. Shortly after, the other 2 appeared. Grace was holding a drawing she'd made by hand, and Lily clutched a children's storybook against her chest. Sarah immediately noticed that these children had far too many guarded feelings for such a young age. As the days passed, the triplets began seeking Sarah's presence the way one recognizes a safe harbor. Sarah never invaded their spaces. She always asked permission, always let the girls decide the pace. Gradually, they opened up. They played together, drew pictures, asked questions, and even sang old songs they'd learned from their mother. Grace began showing Sarah her drawings, using them to express feelings she couldn't voice. Emma's nightmares became less frequent when Sarah sat by her bedside telling gentle stories. Lily slowly learned that Sarah would always return, that goodbye didn't mean forever. James, observing from a distance the gentleness that was beginning to return to his daughters, felt his chest loosen after so long being hardened by constant worry. The house seemed to breathe again, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the sound of children's laughter, and for the first time in years, he slept through the night without waking in a cold sweat from nightmares about losing his girls. Meanwhile, Victoria noticed what was happening and deeply resented it. Sarah's presence was throwing off her carefully laid plans. The triplets, who used to avoid Victoria out of instinctive fear, now had someone who welcomed them with open arms. And James, who had previously been dependent on Victoria's opinions, was beginning to notice things he'd been too exhausted to see before. The discomfort in his children's eyes when Victoria was around, her coldness toward them, and the exaggerated way she tried to impose rules over the simplest things. From that point on, a sequence of silent traps began. Small incidents, but sufficient to put Sarah's reputation at risk. A broken vase left in the wrong place, an inappropriate gift left within the triplets' reach, a veiled accusation here, a cruel comment there. Always subtle, always with the intention of making Sarah appear responsible for problems she hadn't caused. The house became divided. The cook, the ranch foreman, and Mrs. Henderson all knew something was wrong with the episodes that kept happening, but speaking up against the boss's fiancée felt dangerous. The triplets began showing signs of distress again, experiencing restless nights once more. Emma's anxiety attacks returned with increased intensity. Grace stopped drawing and retreated, further into silence. Lily developed a sudden fear of the dark that she'd never had before. Another started having difficulty eating, pushing food around her plate with trembling hands. Sarah, despite being the target of these accusations, remained calm in her demeanor. She continued caring for the girls, helping wherever needed, and never raised her voice or defended herself aggressively, believing that truth would eventually surface. But everything reached a tipping point when Grace had an allergic reaction after receiving candy left anonymously in the girls' shared bedroom. Victoria insinuated in front of everyone that the new employee was responsible, that Sarah must have been careless or worse, deliberately harmful. The commotion took over the house. James, overwhelmed by fear of losing control and desperate to protect his daughters, made a hasty decision. He temporarily suspended Sarah from her duties until the facts could be clarified. His voice was firm, but those who knew him well could hear the uncertainty trembling beneath his words. Sarah's world collapsed. She felt the weight of injustice pressing down on her shoulders, but she refused to let the pain overflow in front of the children. The triplets cried, clinging to the hem of her shirt, begging her not to leave. Emma sobbed so hard she could barely breathe. Grace, who rarely made sounds, let out a heartbroken wail that echoed through the hallway. Lily wrapped her small arms around Sarah's leg and wouldn't let go. Sarah knelt before all three of them, her own eyes wet with tears, and made them a promise. She told them that truth always wins, even when it takes time to appear. She told them to be brave, to remember the songs they sang together, and to keep drawing their feelings until she could return. Mrs. Henderson watched from the kitchen doorway, her weathered hands gripping her apron, tears streaming down her face. She'd seen injustice before in her long years of service, but this cut particularly deep. The ranch foreman, Miguel, a man who'd worked the land for 30 years, shook his head in disgust and muttered under his breath that something wasn't right, that Miss Sarah wasn't the kind of person who'd hurt those girls. Sarah packed her few belongings in silence, her heart breaking with each item she placed in her bag. As she walked down the long driveway toward the main gate, she could hear the triplets crying from their bedroom window. She didn't look back because she knew if she did, she wouldn't have the strength to keep walking. Victoria stood at the front window, watching Sarah's departure with barely concealed satisfaction. Her reflection in the glass showed the hint of a smile playing at her lips. She'd succeeded in removing the obstacle, or so she thought. Now she could proceed with her plans uninterrupted. She'd already begun making arrangements to send the triplets to a boarding school in the east, somewhere far enough that they'd only come home for holidays. James would eventually see it as the practical solution for children who clearly needed specialized attention. But the house without Sarah felt wrong immediately. The triplets refused to eat. Emma's nightmares returned with a vengeance, worse than they'd ever been. She woke up screaming every night, calling for Sarah, her small body shaking with terror. Grace stopped communicating entirely, not even through her drawings. She sat in corners, staring at walls, unreachable. Lily developed a nervous habit of pulling at her hair until Mrs. Henderson gently stopped her, wrapping the child's hands in her own. James watched his daughters deteriorate day by day, and doubt began gnawing at him. He'd made decisions quickly before, but this time something felt different. The evidence against Sarah had seemed clear in the moment, but now, in the quiet hours of the night when he couldn't sleep, he found himself questioning everything. Victoria's insistence on severe punishment for Sarah, her eagerness to discuss boarding schools, the way she seemed almost pleased by the children's suffering, it all began forming a pattern he couldn't ignore. If you were in James's position, would you have trusted your fiancé's word or investigated further? Tell us in the comments what you would have done. 3 days after Sarah's departure, James made a decision. Late at night, when everyone else was asleep, he went to his office and began reviewing the security camera footage. The system had been installed years ago after some equipment thefts, and cameras covered most of the main house's common areas. He'd forgotten about them in his grief and exhaustion, but now they represented his last hope for truth. He started with the day of Grace's allergic reaction and worked backward. Hour after hour he sat in the blue glow of the monitor, watching grainy footage of hallways and rooms. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the normal rhythm of household life. Sarah cleaning, playing with the girls, Mrs. Henderson cooking, Victoria coming and going. Then he saw it, a timestamp from 2 days before the allergic reaction. Victoria, glancing around to ensure she was alone, entering the triplets' bedroom with something in her hand. The angle wasn't perfect, but James could make out a small bag, the kind that might contain candy. She placed it on Grace's nightstand and left quickly. His heart began pounding. He rewound and watched again, his hands shaking so badly he could barely control the mouse. He continued searching through the footage. He found the broken vase incident. Victoria had knocked it over herself, then carefully positioned it near where Sarah typically worked, waiting until Sarah discovered it to call James and point out the damage. He found the inappropriate gift, a toy meant for much older children that Victoria had deliberately placed in the playroom after Sarah had cleaned it, then claimed Sarah must have brought it in. Every accusation, every incident, every piece of evidence against Sarah had been carefully orchestrated by the woman he'd planned to marry. The floor seemed to disappear beneath his feet. He felt sick to his stomach, a physical revulsion at how thoroughly he'd been deceived. But more than that, he felt horror at what he'd done to an innocent woman, at how he'd failed to protect not just Sarah, but his own daughters from someone who wished them harm. As dawn broke over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, James sat in his office surrounded by printed screenshots and notes. His eyes were red from lack of sleep and from tears he'd finally allowed himself to shed. He'd been so desperate for help, so tired and overwhelmed, that he'd let a predator into his home. He'd chosen appearances over instinct, social status over his children's well-being, and Sarah, who'd asked for nothing but the chance to work honestly and had given his daughters something precious, genuine care and affection, had paid the price for his blindness. But now he knew the truth, and now he would make it right, no matter what it cost him. The morning arrived with a light rain washing over the ranch, the kind that makes everything look softer and more forgiving, but James felt no forgiveness in his heart. He'd spent the remaining hours of the night preparing for what needed to happen next. He'd called his lawyer, secured copies of all the footage, and made arrangements he should have made long ago. Victoria descended the stairs at her usual late hour, dressed impeccably as always, her makeup perfect, her demeanor confident. She expected to find James exhausted and defeated as he'd been for days, easy to manipulate. Instead, she found him waiting at the dining room table, surrounded by Mrs. Henderson, Miguel the foreman, the ranch lawyer, and several printed images from the security footage spread across the polished wood surface. Her step faltered for just a moment, a crack in her polished exterior, but she recovered quickly. She smiled, that practiced smile that had fooled him for so long, and asked what was happening, why this meeting hadn't been mentioned to her. James didn't return the smile. His voice, when he spoke, was cold and steady, a tone he typically reserved for business negotiations with people who'd tried to cheat him. He told her to sit down. She refused, claiming she had appointments in town. He told her again. And this. Time there was steel in his words that made even Miguel straighten in his chair. Victoria sat. He laid it out methodically, incident by incident, showing her the footage, the timestamps, the undeniable evidence of her manipulations. He watched as her mask began to crack, as the careful facade she'd maintained for months started crumbling. She tried denial first, laughing nervously and claiming the footage was somehow doctored or misinterpreted. When that failed, she tried anger, raising her voice and accusing him of trusting employees over his future wife. When that didn't work, she attempted tears, but they were as fake as everything else about her, theatrical and unconvincing. Mrs. Henderson, who'd remained silent until that moment, spoke up. Her voice was quiet but firm, carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much to stay silent anymore. She told James that she'd witnessed Victoria being cruel to the triplets on multiple occasions when she thought no one was watching. Harsh words spoken in hallways, pinches delivered under tables, deliberate coldness, designed to make the girls feel unwanted in their own home. Miguel added his observations. Times he'd seen Victoria deliberately ignore the children when they tried to show her something they'd made or done. The way she'd talk about them as if they were burdens rather than the blessings they were. Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She said things then that revealed her true nature. Cruel observations about the triplets, about James, about the ranch and everyone who worked there. She called the girls damaged, said they'd never be normal, claimed James was a fool for letting sentiment cloud his business judgment. Every word confirmed what the footage had already proven, that the woman he'd almost married was someone entirely different from who she'd pretended to be. James told her to leave, not later, not after packing her things properly, but immediately. The lawyer handed her a document she'd need to sign, releasing any claim to the property or to James himself. She grabbed the pen and signed with angry, jerky movements, then stormed toward the door. As she reached it, she turned back and delivered one final attempt at cruelty, telling James that he and his broken daughters deserved each other, that he'd never find anyone willing to take on his pathetic situation. Mrs. Henderson, bless her heart, opened the door wide and said in her gentlest voice that genuine love isn't about taking on situations, it's about embracing people, and that Victoria had never understood the difference. The door closed behind Victoria's retreating back, and the house seemed to exhale as if releasing poison from its walls. But James's work wasn't finished. He had to find Sarah, had to make things right with the person he'd wronged so deeply. Mrs. Henderson had kept in touch with Sarah through text messages, checking on her, even though it had felt like a small betrayal of her employer at the time. Now she gladly provided the address where Sarah was staying, a small motel on the edge of the next town over. James made a decision that felt right in his bones. He went upstairs to the triplets' room, where all three girls lay curled together in Emma's bed, exhausted from days of crying and fear. He woke them gently and told them they were going on a drive. He told them it was time to bring Sarah home. The change in them was immediate and profound. Color returned to their pale faces. Emma actually smiled, a real smile, that reached her eyes. Grace scrambled to find her shoes. Lily jumped up and down with an energy no one had seen in days. They each insisted on bringing something for Sarah. Emma chose a drawing she'd made, a picture of the four of them holding hands under a rainbow. Grace picked a small wooden horse Miguel had carved for her, one of her most treasured possessions. Lily gathered wildflowers from the garden despite the rain, clutching them carefully in her small fists. The drive to the motel felt both endless and too short. James rehearsed what he'd say, how he'd apologize, but every word seemed inadequate for the magnitude of his failure. The triplets sat in the back seat, unusually quiet, as if they too understood the importance of this moment. When they pulled into the motel parking lot, James saw Sarah immediately. She was sitting on a bench outside her room, staring at nothing, her posture conveying a sadness that made his chest ache. She looked thinner than she had just days ago, as if grief had physically diminished her. The triplets didn't wait for the truck to fully stop. The moment James put it in park, they tumbled out, running across the wet pavement, shouting her name. Sarah looked up, disbelief crossing her face, and then she was moving too, dropping to her knees just in time to catch all three girls as they crashed into her, wrapping their small arms around her, crying and laughing simultaneously. James approached slowly, giving them their moment, watching as Sarah held his daughters the way he'd wanted someone to hold them for so long, with pure, uncomplicated love. When she finally looked up at him, her eyes questioning and uncertain, he saw everything he'd missed before in his exhaustion and grief, her kindness, her strength, her genuine care for children who weren't her responsibility, but had somehow become her whole heart. He knelt beside them in the wet parking lot, not caring about his expensive jeans or his pride, and he apologized. Not with excuses or explanations, but with raw, honest words acknowledging his failure. He told her he'd seen the footage, knew the truth, understood the depth of the injustice he'd committed against her. He told her about confronting Victoria, about the lawyer and the signed release, about how the house had felt wrong every moment she'd been gone, but more than that, he told her something he hadn't planned to say, that his daughters needed her, that they'd been slowly healing under her care in ways he hadn't been able to help them heal, and that if she could find it in her heart to forgive him, to come back, he would spend however long it took proving that she'd never be disrespected or doubted in his home again. Sarah listened, tears streaming down her face, the triplets still clinging to her. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the emotion choking her words. She said she'd come back, but she had conditions. She needed respect not just from James, but from everyone on the ranch. She needed the freedom to care for the girls in her own way, without interference or second-guessing. She needed honesty, always, even when the truth was uncomfortable. And she needed James to understand that she wasn't coming back just as an employee. She was coming back as someone who loved those three little girls and would protect them fiercely from anyone who tried to hurt them again, including him if necessary. James agreed to everything without hesitation. He helped her gather her few belongings from the motel room, and they drove back to the ranch together, the triplets talking over each other in the back seat, telling Sarah about everything that had happened, about their nightmares and fears, about how much they'd missed her songs and stories, and the way she never got impatient when they needed extra time to express themselves. Their return to the ranch was met with quiet celebration. Mrs. Henderson hugged Sarah so tightly she could barely breathe, whispering thank you over and over. Miguel shook her hand with both of his weathered face, creased in a genuine smile. The other ranch hands, who'd watched the drama unfold with growing concern, welcomed her back with nods and respectful greetings. Even the ranch dogs seemed to sense something had been set right, wagging their tails and dancing around the group. The days that followed brought transformation. The triplets bloomed like flowers finally getting proper sunlight. Emma's nightmares didn't disappear immediately, but they became less frequent and less intense. Sarah would sit with her until she fell back asleep, sometimes for hours, never complaining or showing frustration. Grace started drawing again, and her pictures became more colorful, more hopeful. She even began speaking more, first in whispers, then in full sentences that made everyone stop and listen with delight. Lily's fear of separation eased as she learned through consistent experience that Sarah would always be there when she needed her, that temporary goodbyes didn't mean permanent loss. James found himself watching Sarah with his daughters, seeing things he'd been too tired and grieving to notice before. The patience she showed Grace when the little girl struggled to find words. The creativity she brought to helping Emma process her fears through play and storytelling. The gentle consistency she offered Lily, creating predictable routines that built security. She wasn't trying to replace their mother, she was helping them carry their grief while still growing and thriving. But he noticed other things too. The way Sarah sang while she worked. Old folk songs and church hymns that filled the house with unexpected warmth. The way she laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to light up whatever room she was in. The way she treated everyone on the ranch with respect, from him to the newest hired hand, as if everyone's work and dignity mattered equally. The way she never seemed to need recognition or praise, content to do good work for its own sake. Somewhere in the rhythm of those healing weeks, James felt something shift inside him. It wasn't the sudden, dramatic passion he'd felt when he was younger, or even the comfortable partnership he'd thought he wanted with Victoria. This was something slower and deeper, like roots growing beneath soil, invisible but essential. It was in the way his heart lifted when he heard Sarah's voice in the morning. It was in how the house finally felt like a home again, not because of any changes to the building, but because of the presence of this woman who taught his daughters how to smile again. Sarah felt it too, though she tried to ignore it at first. She'd come to the ranch needing work, expecting to be an employee and nothing more. She hadn't planned on falling in love with 3 little girls who needed a mother's touch, and she certainly hadn't planned on developing feelings for their father, a man who carried his own grief and was trying so hard to be everything his daughters needed. But love, she was discovering, doesn't always follow plans. It grows in the spaces between everyday moments, in shared glances over children's heads, in conversations that stretch late into the evening about hopes and fears and the future. The shift from gratitude to friendship to something more happened so gradually that neither of them could identify the exact moment it changed. James started finding reasons to be wherever Sarah was, not to supervise but simply to be near her. Sarah started noticing things about him she'd missed before, the gentleness beneath his businessman exterior, the way he listened to his daughters with full attention, the self-awareness that let him acknowledge his mistakes and grow from them. 6 months after Sarah's return, on a cool evening when the first hints of autumn colored the air, James asked her to walk with him after the triplets had gone to bed. They strolled through the property, past the stables and the equipment sheds, until they reached a small hill overlooking the ranch. The stars spread above them in a vast canopy, and the lights from the main house glowed warm in the distance. James took her hand, the first truly romantic gesture between them, and told her what had been building in his heart for months. He said that she'd given his daughters back their childhood, their ability to feel safe and loved and hopeful about the future. But more than that, she'd reminded him what it meant to build a life on truth and care, rather than convenience and appearances. He said he knew they'd started in unconventional circumstances, that he'd wronged her terribly, and would spend the rest of his life making up for it if she'd let him. And then, his voice shaking slightly with vulnerability, he asked if she would consider staying not just as part of the household, but as part of his life, as his partner, as the person he wanted to build a future with. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and James held his breath, suddenly terrified that he'd misread everything, that his feelings weren't returned. But then she smiled, that genuine smile that had drawn him from the beginning, and said yes. She said yes, because she loved those 3 girls as if they were her own. She said yes because she'd seen James at his worst and watched him become better, and she respected that kind of growth. She said yes because sometimes the best love stories aren't the ones that start with fireworks, but the ones that grow from shared purpose and mutual respect and the daily choice to show up for each other. When they returned to the house, they found the triplets pressed against the window of their bedroom, having apparently sneaked out of bed to watch. Emma was bouncing excitedly, Grace wore a smile wider than anyone had seen before, and Lily was actually dancing. They'd understood, with the intuition children sometimes have, that something important had happened, that their family was finally becoming whole in a way it hadn't been since their mother's passing. The house that had once felt shadowed by grief transformed into something new. It wasn't about forgetting the past or replacing what had been lost. It was about honoring memory while embracing the possibility of new beginnings. It was about understanding that family isn't always defined by blood or traditional structures, but by who shows up, who cares, who stays even when things are difficult. In the seasons that followed, the ranch flourished, not because of better business practices or market conditions, though those things mattered, but because the heart of it was finally healthy. James learned to balance work with presence, to prioritize moments over money. Sarah became not just the person who cared for the children, but a full partner in every aspect of the ranch, respected by everyone who worked there. The triplets grew and thrived, each finding their own path while remaining connected to each other and to the adults who loved them. And on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, James and Sarah would sit together and marvel at how life could surprise you, how devastating losses could eventually lead to unexpected blessings, how the courage to face truth and embrace change could transform everything. The ranch, once a place of beautiful isolation and buried grief, became a home filled with laughter, honesty, and the kind of love that's built slowly and carefully, one genuine moment at a time. And the lesson written across every sunset over those Wyoming hills was simple but profound. Family is who takes care of you. Truth is what endures, and love is what grows when lies no longer have room to breathe. Dear listeners, we hope James and Sarah's story touched your heart. If you were moved by this tale of redemption, truth, and unexpected love, click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you most. Was it the triplets' resilience, Sarah's courage to forgive, James's willingness to face his mistakes? Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, exploring what it means to fail, to heal, and to love again. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode, where another powerful story awaits.